All right, welcome back to Rupert and Pinchy. That's George, also known as Rupert. I'm Isaiah, also known as Pinchy. Our main goal here is to jump off the squirrel cage of doom, which I love saying every single time, and instead focus on what is important and aim to the truth. So, with that goal in mind, I would want to start our conversation with a couple of questions for anybody watching, and us, obviously, but we're the ones answering questions here. So, first of all, is there discernible truth? If you say no, I'm sorry, I can't help you on this show. But with that question comes another question. What is the truth, the discernible truth? Are there laws of the universe that are discoverable, that are discernible, that we can see? Are there ways that we can look at reality, even if we don't necessarily believe in God? But are there discernible truths that God gave us the ability to discover? And so, with those questions in mind, I think that's what I have in mind for the questions. So, where does that bring us?
Today we wanted to talk about we're going to talk about law, but more specifically, we want to discuss natural law, and we think you'll find it interesting. It is actually as Pinchy and I have been discussing it for some time now, and reading on it on our own. It gives a lot of great insight. Anyway, so we're going to talk about law, and so in order to do that, we wanted to give some brief background on law in general, and then move right into natural law at however the conversation goes. So when you said that, is law discernible or is truth discernible? Is there laws that govern? And then of course, if there are, then where do they come from?
Right, that's
And
the most important question.
yeah, so we're going to have some presuppositions to begin with, and we believe that law comes from God, or let's say the form or the idea or the existence of law comes from God, and therefore, to some degree, every law that may exist has its root in God creating that concept, that precept, that form of what we
Right.
call law, right? So, uh, so the good philosophers, and there are bad philosophers. In our previous episode on philosophy, we mentioned that philosophy doesn't kill people, but people do.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but people with bad philosophy kill people.
Right. Right.
Right? There is such a thing as bad philosophy,
Correct.
and the history is replete with examples of that. And but generally, when we're talking about philosophy and where this law or the idea of natural law and the idea of a lawgiver comes from is obviously from two places: from Athens, Greece, and Socrates, and from the Jewish people, from God. And ultimately, so there's the three philosophers that are the foundation of just about every
Right.
philosophy, and that's Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And then you have the next two greatest, maybe greater, because they combine they complete philosophy because they include their theology, and that's Augustine and Aquinas. And so most of what we're discussing today is coming from a one of those five or a combination of those five. And so if you stay with those five, generally you're going to be stuck in good philosophy, which is a good thing. So
The funny thing about that is, I'm taking this course on philosophy. It talks about like how he doesn't separate Plato and Aristotle. He's like, they're my two eyes. I can't like separate them. And then we're talking about the five, and I'm like, yeah, we have five eyes that we see with, not two eyes. So
right.
Yeah, that becomes a little weird looking, but I don't know. I was
Well,
just
it's
funny.
just yeah, it's so the origin philosophy is so interesting when you think about of course this is not our subject, but just when you think about in Athens, where coming from Socrates, who um, his fight was against the sophists, which sophists basically mean wise men.
Yeah, yeah,
And then he said, well, I'm not a sophist, but I'm a philosophist. I'm a philosopher.
right,
And because he always believed in the God, not gods, the God. And so he recognized that he loves wisdom
right,
and that all wisdom belongs and comes from God. And therefore, he got his positioning correct.
right. And
Is
the problem with the sophists is that they say that they're wise.
Mhm.
And he's like, his understanding of wisdom is that he would be like being corrected. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't remember exactly the phraseology, but the wise man loves to be corrected. I thought that's Socrates's mentality is he'd
Mhm.
be happy to be corrected, but I doubt that the sophists would be happy to be corrected.
No, because truth to them was relative. They wanted to their from Athens came the idea of jury trials and what was the other thing? Jury trials and whatever. But sophists were used for persuasion. So if so they began the oldest human endeavor or enterprise, which was advertising. And so they were interested in using truth as relative, and the first advertiser could be seen to be in the garden. But anyway, um, and so yeah, Socrates invited correction,
Correct.
and so then when we read in correct,
Yeah, I
or
know.
that is incorrect. uh, and so we see in the wisdom books of the Old Testament
hmm
that same thing. What does it say? The wise the wise hear a wise saying and add to it. Add to it. The fool hears a wise saying and says, "What is this?" and throws it behind his back.
Right. Exactly.
So
Exactly.
anyway, so so from Christian theologians and philosophers, they identified four types of law, and even these are discernible. You know, without even a voice speaking to us necessarily. But
hmm
anyway, so the four designations of law is one eternal law, which is God's law, God in Himself, His law. Then you have natural law, which we're going to be talking about, which applies to anything with a nature, right?
hmm So anything.
So yeah, so applies to a plant, a rock, an angel, a person, um, a fruit, a cheetah. For some reason, I like to use cheetah a lot.
Well, I
But
mean, wouldn't eternal law be God's uh, nature law, like law in His nature, which is just
I
Him.
would, I would, I would have to say it would probably be love, truth, and beauty, God Himself. Um, so so anyway, you got eternal law, then you got natural law, which, uh, and all these come from God.
Oh, right. Yeah, I mean, we
Uh,
get our natures from God, so yeah, it's
right.
all, yeah.
So we have number one, eternal law. Number two, natural law. Number three, what we call human law or human positive law. And number four, divine law, or what we call, not what we call, but what the good philosophers call uh, divine positive law. And so, of those four types of laws, and we'll talk about them a little bit, all of them are established by God,
Mm-hmm.
but there's one that has some caveats to it, and that would be let's just give examples of eternal law. We talked about eternal law. God lovable in himself. To know, love, and serve God would be um, love, to know and love God, which he does himself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because he's eternal love in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit,
Mm-hmm.
the eternal unity, but the eternal family um, uh, of God. So then you think of natural law.
Well, hold on. Don't move on.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
I just have a couple things about eternal law.
Hmm.
A principle that's been being taught to me in the philosophy course that I'm taking is the
Hmm.
idea of what philosophy is. Philosophy is love of wisdom. We've talked about this many times. But
Hmm.
the idea would be that the good is the ultimate wisdom that is discernible, and that would be God. And so
Hmm.
I believe that the eternal law would be God and the good that we're seeking, and that basically um, the goal of wisdom is to be able to take understanding of the eternal nature and to apply that to our physical world. What I mean by that is there are certain circumstances in which we need to act, and prudence is necessary. But the way
Hmm.
that we have prudence and judgment is by keeping one foot on the eternal principles and keeping
Hmm.
one foot in the chaos of the world,
Right.
and being able to balance based on the
Hmm.
eternal principles. And I think that's kind of what the goal of philosophy should be, is to know God, the eternal
Hmm.
principle, the eternal
Hmm.
God. And so I think that's kind of what natural law is. That's what we're seeking. Not natural law, eternal law. That's what we're seeking,
Hmm.
is God himself.
Ultimately,
Yeah,
yep. Hmm.
he is the
Absolutely.
eternal law.
Right. Yeah, it's you mentioned that eternal law applying one foot on the ground and one foot in the air, basically, um, and the one foot in the ground eventually is going to be lifted
Right,
because the ultimate goal is not to remake our world,
right.
but to behold God. Because anyway,
Well, yeah,
we're,
because he's the ultimate wisdom, and that's why I think love of wisdom ultimately means love of God,
yeah,
when applied correctly. So yeah,
yep.
that's just all I wanted to say about that.
Yep. So then we have the second, which is natural law, which we're going to talk about, which is basically natural law is a participation in the eternal law of God in whatever nature. So if you are a cheetah, um,
Cheetah again.
well,
They never get a
you
break.
they're fast. That's why I use them. So and you can spot them with their spots. So
What about the turtles that are super slow? You don't
yeah,
care about them?
but they persevere and they're very diligent and they usually win. Of course, they win against the hares, the
At least in
rabbit.
stories, yeah.
Well, the reason they win against the rabbits is because the rabbits are running great, and then they're like, "Oh, a bush, I want to eat," and they stop, and the turtle just keeps walking on. Anyway, so uh, natural law is a participation in the eternal law because God's created natures, and so
Well, what do you mean
um,
by nature?
uh, a thing, and essence before existence,
The
and
essence of
so
a thing, like a cheetah, like what a cheetah is.
right,
Okay.
cheetah-ness, manness, and so treeness, specifically, mainly speaking on the natural level at this point, or the physical level of so every nature partakes of the eternal law, and that's natural law, basically. It's just a participation in what God has designed. And so, when we talk about natural law, generally, if you come across a YouTube training video or something that's natural law, they're probably not going to go into plants. They're probably not going to go into cheetahs. They're probably not going to go
Right.
into the visible heavens of the planets and stars. They may mention them, but generally they're going to hone in on its application with man.
Right, and I would answer the question, why is that, by saying, well, the natures of animals and plants are very specific. I think those are very pinpoint. You can basically discover those pretty easily. But when it comes to man is a free will agent, meaning he makes
Mm-hmm.
decisions. So it's like, which decisions are good and which decisions are bad, and what is rationality and what isn't rationality. We can tell when how emotion works typically and how instinct
Mm-hmm.
works. But when it comes to man's nature, that is really important to realize. And so when
Mm-hmm.
you're saying the participation in the eternal nature would be, or law would be to say, well, God, by his creative nature, whatever that is, he made humanity and everything that he made has some kind of inclination within itself,
Mm-hmm.
some natural inclinations, and so it's basically God put the good inclinations there, and man corrupts that because he's a free will agent. That's kind of going a little
Mm-hmm.
bit down the
No,
track,
that's
but
good.
yeah,
No, that's good. So, for example, like if you have 100 lions, and let's say you take 10 lions from 10 places, that would give you 100. If you were going to write down, okay, I wonder what this line, I wonder what this line does in life. You know, every lion is going to have the same description.
mm,
Right? Because it's programmed. They're instinct.
yeah,
They're driven by instinct. But if you take 10 people from 10 different places and you analyze what they do and what they pursue, you're going to find a great diversity
right,
because of that free will nature. And um, so that's natural law, and we'll get more into that shortly. The third type of law we called human law, which is also described as uh, human positive
right,
law. And what that simply means, I guess it's self-descriptive. It's human law. Man is a social animal. He gets into a community, and laws become necessary. And so, men, for however they determine to do that, they create a law.
right.
For example, an example of a human positive law would be what, Z?
Well, there's a lot of them, but speed limits,
Yeah,
sure.
speed limits. Yeah, that is human positive law. That's something in addition that they created, um, that God gave him that for. Go ahead.
Well, that's a really important thing to talk about. Is you said addition to. That's what positive law is. Positive law is continuing on the natural law, building on the natural law. It's not coming up with new uh, laws that contradict it. They're supposed to
Right.
go in addition to those other
They
things.
derive from that.
Right, that's
It's a
what
gen.
positive
Yeah.
law means, right? That's what positive
Right.
means. Is it's an addition to that law that comes naturally in the eternal law. It's
Yep.
not it's not in contrast to, it's in addition to. I just
Mm-hmm.
wanted to make that main point to what that means.
Yep. And so then we have the fourth division of law, known as divine positive law.
Hmm.
And someone might say, well, how is divine positive law different from eternal law? And indeed, they're both very similar. But divine positive law is like, or eternal law is like you said. It's almost a singular thing in a sense. It's like God is God. He
Yeah,
is. He does not change. His he revolves around love and truth and beauty. And it just okay. And so what would divine positive law? It's kind of a, you could say, just like human, um, although the difference between human positive law and divine positive law, human positive law can fail.
right.
And we'll go into that but a little bit maybe. But divine positive law is absolutely perfect, you know. And so it would be things that are come to us by revelation.
Right, that would be like the
Uh,
10 Commandments, do you think? At
Yeah,
least some of them. I don't know.
yeah. The Ten Commandments. And in Moses' time, the proper way to offer a burnt offering, that would be a divine positive law given to Moses by God, right?
Yeah, and I think that the thing that I brought up when it came to understanding what human positive law was is that's basically what it is with divine law. It's an addition to. It's not
Mm-hmm.
in contrast to. It's more like expounding on the principles that already govern the universe. So I mean,
Yeah.
I think man naturally doesn't like to murder. They know that it's wrong. It's a law. But
Mm-hmm.
then God comes and says, or Jesus comes and says, if you're angry at your brother, you commit murder in your heart. It's like, that's not in contrast to the actual murdering. It's more like, this is, you should reconcile with your brother. You should do these things. These are in addition to, right? That are
Mm-hmm.
divinely revealed by God. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think forgiveness is really natural to man. Man doesn't like to forgive. But
Mm-hmm.
God, when He revealed that to us, when Jesus revealed that
Mm-hmm.
to us, it wasn't in contrast, it was in addition to.
Yeah, that's like you said, forgiveness. When Jesus gave us a principle, he says, "You won't be forgiven unless you forgive others."
Right.
That's divine positive law. Um, and another difference between divine positive law, to clarify a little bit more from what you said, is divine positive law is perfect.
Right.
And in fact, when you say addition, I know what you mean, but I want to clarify. Rather than say addition, actually, I would like to use the word I just used. It's more of a clarification of what already is.
Right. Right. Correct.
Okay, so when Jesus talks about you can't forgive you won't be forgiven by God unless you forgive others. That principle can be found in the Old Testament
Hmm.
in a lot of places. And so he's just speaking it more clearly and more perfectly. He's revealing, it says that we've said many times, the New Testament is hidden in the Old Testament, and the New Testament, Old Testament is revealed in the New Testament, or however that goes. But they're intertwined,
Right.
and so but I want to make a point, and you kind of brought it up or alluded to it. Is we use the 12 commandments. I added two. Chocolate ice cream is the only ice cream is number 11. No,
It's the
um,
only ice cream. That's a lie.
yeah, it's just the best ice cream. Uh, the 10 Commandments, which we use properly as divine positive law, it's kind of interesting because maybe when we go into natural law, we can see that it's almost already revealed through natural law.
Almost,
But
yeah.
God, you know, it can be everything in the 10 Commandments actually can be revealed through natural law or is, but man is man. And God clarified through Moses. So it's like we wouldn't miss it,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And so anyway, so those are the four types of law. And so we want to focus in on zero in on natural law. So where do you want to go?
Uh, Home.
Natural
I'm
law?
already home. Um,
Yeah.
uh, I think it's interesting talking about this because when we had this conversation before, there wasn't as much clarification in my head. But these things, they all actually mix together. So when we're talking about natural law is based on the eternal law.
Right. It's a participation in it.
Right. So it would be like, um, we have the eternal law, which is God. Then we have the divine law, which is God's revealed law. And then we have natural law, which is anything's law. And but in this instance, we're talking about humans. Then we have human positive law, which is man's. Uh, it's not revealed in the same way as God does, but um, man's addition to the natural law, and so it's interesting because they're just like parallels in that way. Is
Mm-hmm.
one is positive, one is just based on what they are. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, so what? Where would you want to go with natural law? I guess the way that we would want to talk about it is, well, how, what kinds of things fall under natural law? I guess is the kind of question that I would
Okay.
ask.
Well, okay. Well, uh, can I clarify a little bit
Sure.
on what you talked about natural law? Natural law, the reason why it's called natural law is obviously because it has what is there, and if there is, what laws are dictating to uh, every specific nature? Where does that, what are they?
Right.
Is there a law that is dictating to the nature of a cat to be a cat and cat-like? And same with a human-like. That's one thing. The other reason, probably, it's such a fitting name, natural law, is because God, who created, uh, wrote His law on our hearts,
Mm-hmm.
and so it was natural. It was natural that if He was going to create and we're speaking free will agents, if He's going to create free will agents such as angels or men, who amazingly have free will, which we've talked about how amazing that is. And he creates them in such a way that he imprints his image and likeness into them
Mm-hmm.
in a more deeper way than he does a cheetah or a lion or a tree. Even though any created thing reflects God's glory to some degree, greater or lesser. But in man, he put naturally into us these, and you mentioned it earlier in the this podcast, and you called it inclinations. And these inclinations uh, are the law that we're talking about, right? And
Right. Right.
someone can say, "Wow, the difference between law and inclination seems to be great," because the law is like okay, you got to do this, and an inclination is, well, I kind of like to do this.
Oh.
Well,
Right.
but they are not they are not in contradiction. They grow to our inclinations grow to perfection. Grace is to perfect nature, and so but the law. So we're growing toward perfection, right?
Right, in a way that I would explain this to somebody, when with inclination is we do see problems with inclination in the world. But let me ask this question. Are you inclined to believe that Hitler was an evil man? And then I'd say,
Right.
well, why? And I think that's an example of an inclination that is naturally or intuitive. Well, he killed a bunch of people. Why is killing a bunch of people wrong? This is to the secular world. It's like they can't really
Mm-hmm.
answer that. But I think that
Right.
the answer is, well, God made that as an inclination in man that murder would be wrong, and it's based on God's divine or eternal
Eternal law.
law,
Mm-hmm.
which determines that. And so it's like, I think we can answer that in Christianity by saying, well, we got our nature from someone. He gave it to us. And so it'd be like,
Mm-hmm.
that's an example of an inclination that is clearly God given. And then we talked about corrupted inclinations, though. If we talk about corrupted inclinations, we see that everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not because God put that necessarily in us, those bad inclinations. But those are just parts of what being free will agents are.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of what being a free will agent.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. Well, okay. So uh, maybe it would be good to just give a couple definitions of natural or of law in general.
right.
We didn't talk about that, right? Do you think it's necessary to go into that?
Sure, if you want.
To give a
Right.
Well, it's just to give that concept. There's a couple concepts in here uh, uh, that are important. So,
A
according to
couple. Just a
Aquinas,
couple.
yeah, uh, according to Aquinas and others, a general definition of law, which is a good definition, is law is an edict of reason from the ruler, second part, for the community he rules, third part.
Mhm.
So we're probably going to include a couple attachments on this podcast. So if you want to go back, you'll be able to
Go
use
back.
these. Go back and pull those up and look at our notes and stuff like that. But
Okay. Yeah.
so three really important things. Law is an edict of reason, which is it's not an edict of the will. It's not arbitrary. It's an edict of reason from the ruler for the community he rules. So that is a good general definition. A more complete, and we'll probably qualify it with some, would be, it sounds a lot the same, but there's a couple adds to it. Law is an ordinance of reason. Sounds familiar. For the common good. That's something a little bit new. Made by him who has care of the community. That's the ruler. And promulgated. And so later on, we'll talk about the common good and promulgated and how that's very important to understand and how it qualifies, especially in human law or human positive law. How that helps clarification of what we might call a good law or bad law. But anyway, so natural law is something that God imprints upon us, like you said, the inclinations. And so, to explain what we mean, the first precept that you'll find in all good philosophy, Christian philosophers and theologians, and even in Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle,
Mhm.
we're not Christian or pagan. Is that the first precept is that we innately know, it has been written on our heart to do good, pursue it, and avoid evil. That is the first bedrock, bottom or top, depending upon how you build your structure, principle. That all other principles of natural law can be traced back to.
Right.
It's
Well, I
it's to
think that
do.
that's a
Go ahead.
really good thing to bring up because we talked about this kind of with good and evil, our conversation on that. Man acts when he foresees or sees something good in his action. And so any person would obviously think, well, I want good things and I don't want bad things. I don't want to be hurt. I want to live. And so it's like, clearly, there's some inclination within us to pursue good and reject evil. Uh, you know, a man acts only with what he thinks seems good to him at the time. And so,
Mm-hmm.
any man, even if he has a corrupted inclination, he ultimately sees some good in what he does, even if it isn't good. And that's like the purely vicious person would do the wrong thing and not necessarily know that
For
he's
the
doing the wrong
sake
thing.
of it. Yeah.
Right. And so,
Mhm.
where was I going with that? Oh, just to bring up that there is a corrupted inclination within man, but it's always directed at what they perceive as good. Is their action is always aimed at something that they perceive as good, and so that's just a natural thing to man to not
Mhm.
want to hurt himself, unless obviously he thinks hurting himself would be beneficial. If you know what I'm saying.
Right. Well, there is the when you say there's a corrupted inclination, um, before we go there, let's talk about, okay, so we said do good, um, pursue it, and avoid evil. So let's go in the most basic, from that principle, let's go to the most basic thing. Every man and woman wants to live,
Mm-hmm.
wants to thrive in life. There's an innate desire for us to live, to to persevere, to exist.
Right.
And that is the inclination that God has placed there for a reason.
Well, I just say that's in everything that exists.
Everything.
And even rocks, even though they don't have actual inclinations, but they still exist. They somehow sit there and exist.
Yeah, but not through free will, but through God's edict,
right?
Dictated by reason of the ruler of over those, because God rules over rocks, trees, humans, everything that is created, and so in us we have a free will, but He gives us inclinations to want to live,
right?
And so to live is a good, and so. Applying the natural law would be like, okay, if living is good, then I should live and I should pursue to live.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And any action that I may or may not take, which causes me to put that in danger, would be considered an evil.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So again, going back to our previous episodes where, so if living is good, and therefore, in order to live, I have to eat. If I refuse to eat, then I would hurt myself.
Mm-hmm.
We're not talking about fasting or discipline from an athletic point of view. We're just talking about if someone just refuses to eat, ever, that would be considered an evil, right? You are denying your inclination to live, and you are denying taking food to help you live. And so, just like we said, it's a lack. You're lacking food. The evil is a result of you not pursuing the good.
Right. I mean, it's a result of just having free will.
So then you go to the next step and you go like, okay, so not only are we to love our lives, and love life, and pursue life, and want to remain alive, we all of a sudden realize that the next thing would be like, we want our species to live.
Right, and we also don't want other people to harm us.
And we don't want other people to harm us. And so then you go like, okay, so I want to live, but I also want my species to live. So it's innate in us to propagate our species. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Oh, I was going in a different direction. Sorry.
Go. No. Your direction was fine. But we want to propagate our species. And then, okay, so then something from the natural inclines us to go like, okay, I want to live. I want my species to live, so we have children. Well, children just aren't birthed, and then they go off and become scientists.
Right.
Hopefully not. Hopefully they become, prophets, priests, and kings. But no, it's okay if they're scientists on the side. But anyway, so kids aren't just birthed and then go. No, they need to be trained.
Right.
So there's the natural inclination to teach them and raise them up and rear them.
Right.
And then you go like, oh gosh, there's starting to be more people here, and I kind of like it. People like people. And all of a sudden you realize, oh, it's natural that we live in a society, in a community.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to go to when I said,
okay,
I don't want to be hurt, is that, well, if you don't want to be hurt, then don't hurt someone else. Because maybe their tribe will come after you because they want vengeance, or maybe they'll end up killing you instead. And so that's what I was getting at, was that when I said you don't want to be harmed, is, well, that kind of brings us to living in a society. We don't, a civil society, one that's civil.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I don't want to be hurt, so I'm not going to hurt. I want my children to grow up, and I want children. Okay, I need them to grow up first before they go out into the world. And then it's like, well, there was another thought that I had. Oh, we don't want to be harmed by nature, so we're going to go into groups and try and build shelters for ourselves. It's
Mhm.
too hard to do it by yourself, and so it's like there's a bunch of things that just naturally occur when you're actually thinking. You're a thinking,
Mhm.
rational human being. Is these things just start to make sense? It's like the
Mhm.
best way to survive is to live in society.
Mhm. Mhm. So you talked about we don't want someone to harm us, and so earlier on in the podcast we talked about how in human or divine positive law of the Ten Commandments is actually can be discernible, should be discernible, but we have weaknesses and vices, and because of the fall, our passions were disordered, and our higher faculties, flesh against spirit, fighting against one another. But it's discernible to know that you should not murder,
Hmm.
even without God telling us that, because you want to live, and because you're reasoning intellect, you have an intellect, reason, and a will. You can discern because God placed that ability to know what good is.
Hmm.
You can discern that, well, if I don't want someone to kill me, I can abstract out that that person over there probably doesn't want me to kill them. And then I can abstract out also that Org doesn't want me to steal his club
Hmm.
that he made because I don't want Org to steal the club that I made or the bow and arrow that I made. And so all the things in the Ten Commandments, even within natural law. Now, some men, there's a variety of vice and virtue, but and we'll talk about that a little bit, and maybe in the next episode. But um,
Yeah, we're kind of running out of a little bit.
well, how are we doing on
We're at
time?
43 minutes about.
Okay, so as we that first principle of do good, pursue it, and avoid evil. From there, all these different avenues start to build upon one
Right.
another. And as you get from that initial point, it gets a little more complex or seemingly obscure, but it all can be traced back to seeking the good. And so God has placed in man's heart the inclination to seek the good.
Yeah, I want to ask a couple of questions about this.
Go ahead.
So, some people would say, well, why do we have to say that God gave it to us? Why can't we just say that it happened to be this way?
Hmm.
Like, why does God have to exist for this to make sense? Or, how do we know that God gave it to us? These
Well,
inclinations.
let me give one example, and then might not be good. Speech.
What about it?
Now, this is not. This is not. I suppose you could call it natural law in some regard, but speech. Every human has an innate ability to speech, not just to repeat words like a bird, but actually to formulate
Right.
words into an idea and speak and have someone understand the words. Language is what I'm saying. Language is something innate in man. It might be Spanish, you know, it might be what Aramaic, it might be Greek, it might be Latin, it might be English, it might be Italian. But language is something innate in man. And so your question then is I'm just giving an example, something that's innate in everybody that they do not acquire through training.
Mm, okay.
It gets developed through training and through hearing others, but it couldn't get developed. It wasn't there. So a philosopher once said that it's not so much that we are learning as we are remembering. and because it's implanted there before we even start to cogitate.
Yeah,
or
you're
think.
referring to Socrates and talking about discovering truth, I believe.
versus the false philosophy, which says that we create truth.
Right.
Truth is our truth, or what we create, or what we project.
One example of what you're referring to is the design of a triangle. We can discern what a triangle is in our mind, even if triangles didn't exist in the world. What I mean by that is we could still discover them. But where are triangles if they weren't? What was I gonna say? How do you discern what a triangle is unless you have some idea of it in your innately in your head? Is the idea? There's more to that, but that's kind of the idea.
So, but I realize that I'm not specifically answering your question as far as why do we say that God put it there?
Right. Why can't we say that this is how the question would go? Why can't we just say that this is how it is? Not that there was a God that was involved in these inclinations within us. And one thing that I thought of an answer to this is there are some things that can't be answered by natural law alone. What I mean by that is there are certain things that are in the Bible that I would never understand if it was not revealed. And so I don't exactly have an example on the top of my head, but are there certain things...
The Trinity, maybe?
Right. But are there certain things that are only explained by God and not by our natural, just the natural world?
Well, the answer to that would have to be yes, right? And I would come back to the Trinity, the incarnation. So we are always taught that a cat is not a dog and a dog is not a cat. Okay, but yet in the incarnation we have God and man coming together with two natures into one person.
Right, but you would have to see that's God, but how do we know that happened?
Well, I'm going back to you asked what are some examples of what maybe God has to reveal in order for us to
well, God does have to reveal those, but I mean that things that can't be answered. Okay, I would say that Jesus doing miracles is not explainable by just natural things, natural occurrences, and I think the evidence for those things actually happening are great. So that's something that can't be explained by this is just the way that it is. Jesus had to have had the power from somewhere. Right?
Right. Well, and so, right. So, what you're saying is that before Christ came, well, let me put it this way. So, we talked about the incarnation, the Trinity, but I don't want to, keep miracles in mind too. That's a good one. Is even though those things, for us to understand them, they have to be revealed. Once they're revealed, then our mind can draw analogies from things that we see exist and then understand them. So, for example, when we think about the incarnation and the two natures in one person, human and divine, we can see that in a husband and wife when they have a child. The child is a combination of the two, yet it's one. And so even though that's not a perfect example, it's not like that means the mother and the father are coexisting in this one human. It's not exactly like the incarnation, but similar so that we can draw our understanding. But just to have the idea of the incarnation has to be something that is revealed. So that's why one of the most difficult things for Jews in that time when Christ came is he's claiming to be God. Explicitly and implicitly. So then let's go to miracles. If we had the right understanding of God, which means God created all things, and he is not subject to nature, but nature is subject to him, it would logically follow that he could enter and supersede nature and walk upon the ocean, right? Multiply loaves where it doesn't make sense. Change water into wine. Logically, we could deduce that, okay, God could do that. Now, we may not know how. I don't know if that's answering your question.
Oh yeah, that's where I was going when it came to answering the person that would say, well, couldn't that just be the way that it is? And so basically I was just going to say, well, there are certain things that we see happen that can't be explained purely naturally. They have to be explained by God. And I would say a couple of things. Somebody might say, well, other people have done miracles. Okay, what kind of miracles? Who did them? Was it, and did they have good character? Which means, did they deceive you is basically the idea. Whereas Jesus would have to be deceitful, or he actually thought that he was doing the miracles. And him being deceitful doesn't match up with his character. It doesn't match up with anything else that he says. So it's like, he doesn't really have anything to gain. He actually had something to lose by being killed. So it's like, I would take his miracles as seeming more likely to actually have happened than to take someone else who has something to gain, like the Egyptians are trying to deceive. Whereas Moses had everything to lose by faking miracles. Let's think about this. What if he's facing off against Egyptian magicians? Couldn't they somehow discern his magic tricks if they were magic tricks? They'd be like, oh, they were facing off, obviously, but then there was a point where they could no longer do the same miracles that Moses did. Is that because Moses had an extra trick up his sleeve? I don't think so.
He had a doctorate in magicology?
Right. And there's no way that he could know that it was going to work unless, he had some divine help. But that's just the point I was trying to make is, it does seem that there are certain things that can't be explained by natural causes. Another thing is prophecies. Prophecies can't be explained by natural causes. Unless you're saying that the person that wrote it down came up with, discerned that was going to happen in the future. That doesn't make any sense. I think there's plenty of prophecies that can only be explained. So that's kind of the idea I was getting at. And I don't, we're kind of running a little low on time, so we should go into the common good and promulgated soon.
Okay. So, before we get there, so that's why at the beginning of the episode we said we're gonna admit some presuppositions. That law comes from God, and so we don't need to explain. If someone asks us, well, why do you think natural law came from God? Or that doesn't mean there's a God. Well, we already presuppose that.
Oh, okay.
And we could go into, we could go into explanations or philosophical explanations of why we believe that. And one of them could be every man ever created wants to live and wants to preserve life. It's not just something that just happened. Why is it every man? But, or woman. So when we say man or man, we mean human,
mankind.
But so we presuppose that. But the main thing about natural law is, and it seems counter to sometimes of some things that we've been taught, or some allusions to this, that man is actually, upon his heart is written God's law that is to incline us to the good. It doesn't, what we're not saying is that man is naturally good.
Right.
We're saying he's inclined. He's given a couple aces in his hand to go like, hey, I'm going to write my law in your heart, but because I don't want you simply to be a computer, I want you to develop or pursue the good, to start building toward doing the good more than you do the evil. And so, right?
Well, yeah,
So,
and a couple of those inclinations would be musical taste. You know, looking at landscapes and being like, "Oh, that's beautiful." These are inclinations. Is we're inclined to things that are good and beautiful. You know, when it comes to that, that doesn't mean that we're not gonna that we're good. Obviously, like you said, but you know, I don't think somebody would hear something off key and would be like, "Man, that's what I want to listen to every day, all day." And I mean, that's
mhm,
kind of the world that we live in. Is people like make that claim that they would like to listen to terrible things and look
right.
at things that are ugly, but it's like, dude, I would. I think it's obvious that somebody would rather listen to a symphony than like, you know, nails on a chalkboard. But
Right.
those are certain inclinations within us.
So, 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 because you want to move on to human law and the common good, and that we
Promulgated.
still got a couple things to talk about on natural law.
Okay.
We just want to just define that natural law, redefine again or restate that natural law in regarding people, we're talking people, is a participation in the eternal law. Is man's participation in the eternal law. And so, in that natural law is the inclination to the good with the initial precept or the foundational precept that every man it's been written on his heart to do good, seek it,
Mm-hmm.
and avoid evil. And then of all those things, they start to go to, okay, that's life, family, raising a family, living in a community. And then also something very important is avoiding ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, have the capacity to know and to love. And so to love and to want to know and understand is a inclination that all people have, that God placed there, wrote on our hearts. And then also religion, the fact that the reason why Pinchy and I have, through numerous different episodes, said that religion, we're careful when we say it, but it's natural to man. And what we've always meant is that God, given the reason, will, and intellect, man can discern that he has a greater purpose and that there's a good outside of himself that he wants to pursue, and that good is known as God. And so that's why it's natural to seek God. And so one of the main differences between Plato and Aristotle, it's not a huge difference. Plato said to know the truth uh, is 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 uh, uh, is to do the truth, where Aristotle kind of said no, to know the truth, to know truth is to repeatedly do the truth in repetition. And his was a virtue ethics, and so it was based on virtue. So it's not just enough to know the truth, but it's to know and do the truth. That was the addition that Aristotle did on top of Plato, his teacher. And so it wasn't a disagreement, but it was an addition. It was a lifting up higher.
Mm-hmm.
And so where are we going to go with that? So that's natural law. And so then when we go back to the definitions that we gave at the beginning, and we talk about we gave a general definition and a comprehensive definition, and then we want to talk about human positive law. So where do you want to go with that, Z?
Well, yeah, you said that we were going to talk about the common good and promulgated later, so that's kind of what I wanted to make
Okay.
sure that we got to before we're done, because we're in an hour. That's all.
Okay. Well, let me give the first example that's written in the first pages of the Bible of that comprehensive definition. Is that God created Adam and Eve, and He created the garden. He had all these fruit trees, and He gave a law. It was dictated by God's reason, which is absolutely it's always living in the present. It doesn't change. So anyway, so God gave a law dictated by His reason not to eat the fruit of the knowledge of the tree and good and evil. He gave that law to those He ruled, Adam and Eve,
Mhm.
and He gave them that law for the common good, and it was promulgated by Him telling them that
What does promulgated mean?
to give or make known.
Okay.
Okay? So if any one of those aspects of that comprehensive definition of law had been left out, then it might have been a law, but not an effective one.
Mhm.
Or someone could even say it wasn't even a complete one, so therefore it wasn't a law. So if God had the law, if God by His reason determined that they're not to eat the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, and that He wanted that for Adam and Eve, okay, and He wanted it for their common good, but He didn't tell them, would they have been breaking a law had they ate the tree of the knowledge of good
Right. I
and
mean,
evil?
if they
No.
didn't know, how could they be held responsible for not doing the right thing? If they
Right.
didn't know.
Right. And so that's why all those aspects of law are important for it to be effective, first of all. And someone might even say for it to be a law in the first place. So, so one of the reasons why, just think about, we're no longer under the old covenant, but we're under the law of grace. And so the law of grace is an edict of reason. It's for the common good. It's made by God who has rule over everything. And it must be promulgated. And so that's why we spread the gospel, because that's the promulgation.
Right. It's to be known. We want it to be known.
Right. And so He includes us in the work of salvation by promulgating the truth. So let's talk about, well, what happens when in human law, if human law is based on deriving from the natural law, which we admit is good and true, what happens when it deviates it? So, for example, I mean, give a real basic example, Z, that you think displays it
You're talking
easy.
about in the human term, in the human laws, or
Well, for example, like for life, for example, the natural law says we should live.
okay,
We want to desire to live and seek to live and promote to live and preserve our life and preserve our race. So to pass a law, for example, on to make abortion legal is counter to the natural law, right?
right? I was just asking. So you're talking about
Oh,
in
okay.
human laws.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think we could talk about abortion, but I think one that also can illustrate the point of at least the promulgation part would be speed limits.
Right.
If you don't know the speed limit, how can you be punished for not following the speed limit?
Yeah, you can't be. I got pulled over a couple of years ago coming home from a Green Bay Packer game that we lost to the Vikings
Like, yeah,
with my nephew in the car who likes the Vikings. Anyway, and I got pulled over and I didn't see the speed limit sign. And the officer told me I was speeding. I said, "Well, it seems unfair, blah blah blah, that I didn't." And then he pointed out the sign, and which I didn't happen to see. It was like 2 a.m. or very late. And so, and I was in an area, but yeah, the posting of speed limit. So let's say there's a law that outlaws posting speed limits because they don't want to put posts in the ground. Well, then in that case, everyone in town would be told the speed limit in town is 30 miles an hour from the time they're born. So it's promulgated that way. But you're right. If there's not a speed limit sign, how would you know? Would you be held responsible?
Well, you shouldn't be, but that depends on who's in charge. But
Yeah. Well, then it would require more investigation. Then we go, okay, you're right. It's not posted. Was there any other way that it was promulgated?
Mhm.
Right? And then they go like, well, yeah, it was this. Is that reasonable?
Right.
Then you go like, then maybe in a court of law, they might go like, no, that's not reasonable. We need to change that or post speed limits. Okay, so what about the common good?
Right. I mean, it would be like, um, hmm, is this for the common good? Okay. I don't want to go super in depth with this, but COVID, lockdowns, were those
Mhm.
really for the common good?
They claimed it to be correct.
Right. But
Mhm.
how could we know that if it wasn't for the common good?
Right. Right. Well, then you have to ask yourself, was it ever passed as a law?
Right.
But okay, that you had to be locked down. And so let's just, for the sake of what you brought up, let's say a law was passed. But that's where the real travesty was. There were no laws passed, but yet they made us people obeyed them against their common sense.
Mhm.
But just for the sake of this argument, let's say there was a law that you had to be locked down. Okay?
Mhm.
They would all say that it was promulgated, that it was made by the ruler has authority over the community,
Mhm.
whether that's the Congress or a president or a governor or a mayor, whatever. And that it was done for the common good. And that's where you go like, well, was it really for the common good?
Right. That's the question.
Yeah. And so then you and I being free creatures, not completely free, like completely divorced from any authority or rule of law,
Right.
but we have freedom of conscience. And if it violates our conscience and we consider it an evil, then we have every right to disobey that law.
Right. And in this instance, uh, I don't think it was for the common good, and I think that there's good evidence for that. And because of that, I thought that it was right for people to go to church and to not wear masks and to not be locked down because it was. I think it was obvious, but I don't know. I mean, so like, how would we know if it was for the common good?
Right. Well, so a lot of times after laws, the intention, that's why it says the law is an edict of reason. So, you know, you're supposed to reason, use your intellect and reason to come up with a law. And you want to project that it's for the common good and whatnot, and that's your intention. Well, what if it ends up not being for the common good? Whether it's done maliciously or because you're ignorant in creating that law, it has the opposite effect than the common good.
Right, but so if the intention was for the common good, would it be okay to follow it? Or is it like, well, I don't think it will end up that way, and so I'm going to decide to break that law even though I don't know that it violates the common good?
Well, that's why this is good to talk about because, okay, so whether it was intentional or unintentional, you first have to ask yourself, is it a law? On one side, and this is not a contradiction. On one side, you could say, well, it doesn't even meet the definition of a law because it's not for the common good. So I could call it not a law. But then other people will say, well, it is a law because it's written down and it's being enforced. So regardless of which position you take, whether it actually is a law or maybe it's an unjust law, then you have that self awareness, and you have freedom of conscience to disobey the law. Those whenever we disobey the law, it has to be approached very carefully, because a lot of times it's just our unwillingness to obey. But we have to be willing to go, like, some of the problem that a big problem for us Christians is that we want to disobey unjust laws or even evil laws, but we don't want to have any consequences for it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right? So the problem with that is that you want something easy. If you're going to disobey a law, you have to be willing to go, like, well, the law says that if I disobey this, I'm going to have a $200 fine. Well, if it's important and you believe that it's a matter of principle and morality, you have to disobey it, regardless of what the punishment might be. So
yeah, well,
anyway.
I still have the question. So, what would you say about COVID? Is how do you know that it ended up at least not being for the common good?
Well, that would be a whole episode, but early on we had questions about what is the purpose behind this.
Right. Well, even not even that. What I would say is, like, first of all, it's not good for people not to interact with other people. Second of all, germs are necessary for us to keep our immune systems up, so that's clearly not good if we don't have access, or at least lesser germs.
Mm-hmm.
The the uh, the enforcement based on skewed statistics, which could be known from the beginning. I mean, other people were saying these aren't correct statistics. There's not going to be 2 million people this year. I don't remember exactly what the number was.
Mm-hmm.
And then the vaccine, for instance, has problems. One, it was developed too quickly. Two, it's not been tested, so how do we know that it's going to be for the common good? And then, masks. Masks aren't proven to work in this situation. Where
They're actually proven not to work.
Right, and then 6 feet apart. Where do they even base that on? But you know what I'm saying is there are certain things that could be known from the beginning that would say this isn't for the common good.
So this is a really good. COVID is a really good example of a failure of law in so many levels.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to read this real quick, and then I'm going to ask you. Law is an edict of reason from the ruler for the community he rules. If you think the law was reasonable, the COVID laws, and you think it was for the community, although I think for the common good of the community, and for the community, and for the common good, even though I disagree with you on those two, even though I would disagree with you on two, if I granted that to you, you have a real big problem, because it says from the ruler. In our country, laws are enacted by Congress
Mm-hmm.
and enforced by the police and adjudicated by the courts. Congress did not pass any laws regarding COVID. So who made these laws? Were they even qualified would they even meet the definition of ruler? And my answer to you would be no.
Well, hold on.
Tony Fauci is not a ruler.
Okay, well, Fauci's not the one that enforced any of the rules.
No, I'm just using him as an example.
Well, let me just.
That is easy to identify.
Well, there were people that were using emergency powers. But were those emergency powers granted by Congress? Or the idea of those emergency powers? Were they?
Right. In some cases, not, but for example, like in Michigan, Governor Whitmer called on emergency powers, and I think it's possible. I don't know if she waited for her Congress in Michigan to give her those powers, or if she just enacted. Granted, uh, someone can say claim emergency powers, and that is following the law, and so then they would be a just ruler, or they would fit the definition of ruler.
Yeah.
But that's where, to me, whether they would fit that definition or not, that's where I think mistakes happen on every level of what a law is defined as. Is it an edict of reason? Questionable. Was it a ruler commanding? Questionable. Was it for the good of the community? Questionable. And so from every point,
we're at 1:15, just so you know.
Yeah. Okay. So coming back to, are we finished up on how in human law there are times, and it's the only segment of law, because you have eternal law, natural law, and divine positive law. In those three cases, they are exact and they are without fault. It's only in human positive law, when humans pass laws, that error could be, or deficient law, or a law that's so deficient someone might say it's not even a law. It's not even qualify as a law. Or it's a perversion of law. Only in human law do we see this deviation. And so, is there anything more on the human positive law?
Not that I have on mind.
Okay. So coming back to natural law. So we say that there is natural law in all these different avenues, basing from the first principle of do good, pursue it, and avoid evil. Like Aristotle said, we start being true to the truth as we do it. And he said that virtues are the things, or the tools, or habits are the things that make us successful in fulfilling the natural law or not fulfilling it. So if we are given to vice, we will do poorly at fulfilling natural law or pursuing the good. Whereas if we pursue virtue and build virtue, we will do better and better at pursuing the good. And virtues are those tools that we use knowingly or unknowingly to pursue the good, as natural law dictates. So
yeah, we might discuss that. That's a good place to end. I think that not today, but like we had talked about virtues, doing things on virtue, and I think that's a good way to end it if we are going to do that, which I hope we are.
All right, so we may include some
notes,
some links, some notes and links that others may find hopeful. Our listeners out there might find helpful, not hopeful. Hopefully they're helpful.
Hopefully they're. Oh goodness, you thought you said the question, the joke before I could.
Interesting. So all right. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time. We know your time is valuable. Pinchy, thank you as always for your insights, and Godspeed.
Have a good week.